la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 15, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, we're talking about Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, the father of the public relations industry. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to the birthday of Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara, who we heard from in the intro. Today is the anniversary of his birthday. For me personally, somebody who has inspired me throughout my journey as a socialist, as a communist, as a city builder, which we can talk with Caleb as well, who has influenced me. And of course, joining me today is my good friend, longtime friend of mine, Caleb Maupin, who is a journalist and political analyst. Please subscribe to his channel, Caleb, youtube.com/Caleb Maupin TV. How's it going, Caleb, in New York?
All is good. It's a lovely day, a little chilly for the summertime, but that's okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing pretty well. I recently started doing some research on Netflix because one thing that I find very interesting is the way in which Netflix has been really attempting to dive into a lot of communities of color, something that me and my girlfriend Ophelia, you know Ophelia as well, we were talking about the other day that we find it interesting how Netflix has been trying to produce a lot of content aimed at communities that have usually not been represented in media, Latino communities, Black communities, indigenous communities. And we always have to question whenever the capitalists are doing something like that, why are they doing that, right? Because on the one hand, while it is positive and good to see more media representation, see more diversity, we also have to understand it from the point of view of capitalism, the capitalists, and what agendas they have for that audience. And I started doing some research on Netflix, and I found out that the founder and first CEO of Netflix, Marc Randolph, is the great-nephew of a man named Edward Bernays. And that led me to a whole nother Wikipedia. You know those late nights where you're just on Wikipedia all night till like 3 a.m. going down the rabbit hole. And I went down the Wikipedia rabbit hole of Edward Bernays. I never heard of this guy until recently. I'm kind of late to the game, as I was mentioning to you earlier. But this guy, man, he has such a crazy history in U.S. imperialism and capitalism. I mean, going back to the early 1900s, the mid 1900s, the Cold War, his mark is definitely there. And it's somebody who we almost never really hear about. Before I get into talking about some background on Edward Bernays, what do you, Caleb, know about him?
Well, there's a lot of anecdotes. I mean, obviously, he's a relative of the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, very influential in advertising in particular. The most famous anecdote that I've heard about Edward Bernays is, well, basically, if you have a female relative who smokes cigarettes, you can thank Edward Bernays for that, because in the 1930s, I believe, the cigarette company realized that there was about 50% of the human race that was not buying their products. It used to be that smoking cigarettes was considered to be a very male thing to do. women just didn't do it. It was a manly thing. Men smoked cigars, men smoked cigarettes. Women did not. It was dirty, it was smoky, and ladies didn't do that. So Edward Bernays apparently had a relationship with a tobacco company, and he realized that this was a bit of a problem. So he hired a lot of very, very good-looking women during the New York City Thanksgiving parade, if I'm not mistaken, to stand around in the area where all of the floats were, where the media would be taking pictures and such, and smoke cigarettes. And all these supermodels were there smoking cigarettes and getting photographed by the media. And all over the media, all over the newspapers and all of that, there were pictures of these beautiful women smoking cigarettes. And as a result, suddenly women started smoking in the 1930s. And now women smoking is not unheard of. So if you have a female relative who smokes, you can thank Edward Bernays for that. And that mainly the way he did it was he figured if you want to get women to smoke, you have to get past the idea that smoking is dirty, right? So we need to find very sexually attractive women and make the link between sexual arousal and cigarettes in the minds of the public. And that much of what Edward Bernays did, because there's a lot of people who look at the relationship between Edward Bernays and Sigmund Freud and say, well, there's no relationship. Well, the common strand you can find is the subconscious, right? Sigmund Freud said, look, there's a lot of what goes on in your mind you're not aware of, right? You have desires, you have feelings you're not aware of, right? We have our conscious mind that thinks, but we also have our libido and our natural bodily desires. We also have our superego and our conscience and all of that. And that Edward Bernays, a lot of his propaganda was designed to appeal to feelings people did not realize they had. If you ask people, women why they were smoking cigarettes, you ask men why they were suddenly attracted to women who smoked cigarettes, they wouldn't make the link, right? It was appealing to people's deeper subconscious desires, which is a big part of Freudian psychoanalysis. So that's about where my knowledge of Edward Bernays stops. I mean, he's considered the father of modern propaganda, hugely influential in advertising and advertising theory, and there's a lot of advertising research, keep in mind, that's not available to the public. And, there are whole institutes that do nothing but, marketing research and all that. And you pay them to get that information. You can't read it in a book. You can't find it out. You talk about Madison Avenue in the advertising industry and propaganda. There's lots and lots and lots of very expensive, very well-funded research that only people who have the big bucks get access to. And that designing slick, sexy propaganda that's very good at convincing people of stuff is not something that anyone can just Google.
I think that's a pretty good breakdown of Edward Bernays. I mean, I think that he's most recognized for that cigarette propaganda and promotion in mainstream media. Just to give everybody some more background, I'm just finding out about this guy, and I was really fascinated by his role in not just selling products as well, but his role in U.S. imperialism and selling war, which I think is something that he is kind of almost never talked about. Edward Bernays was born in Vienna, Austria-Hungary, 1891. As Caleb mentioned, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who was a neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis. In 1892, his family moved to New York City. In 1912, he graduated from Cornell University with a degree in agriculture, but he chose journalism as his first career. Keep in mind, 1912, this is the rise of photography, of all sorts of media that is totally changing, revolutionizing life in the US and abroad. After graduating from Cornell, Bernays worked as a creative press agent for corporate performers. After the US entered World War I, the Committee on Public Information, interestingly enough, also called CPI, but that's kind of another offshoot, hired Bernays to work for its Bureau of Latin American Affairs based in New York City. Bernays focused on building support for war domestically and abroad, focusing especially on businesses operating in Latin America. And Bernays himself referred to this work as, quote, psychological warfare, which is really interesting. After World War I, Bernays said that he could continue propaganda during peacetime, saying, quote, this is a direct quote from him in his book Propaganda, "There was one basic lesson I learned in the CPI, that efforts comparable to those applied by the CPI to affect the attitudes of the enemy, of neutrals, and people of this country could be applied with equal facility to peacetime pursuits, In other words, what could be done for a nation at war could be done for organizations and people in a nation at peace. And that's exactly what he went on to do during the middle of the 1920s, from 1919 to 1961. He worked in New York City as a, quote, public relations counsel. During this time, he met with and advised Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, who was president from 1949 to 1952, where he was raising money for the Zionist organization in New York City. He also reportedly turned down work for the Nazis, the Somoza family from Nicaragua, Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain, and Richard Nixon as clients. But United Fruit Company, which today is known as Chiquita Brands International, that's the brand that has the woman with the basket of fruit on her head that everyone buys, hired Bernays in the early 1940s for the purpose of promoting banana sales. So they first hired him to create the image of, just like how Caleb was talking about with cigarettes, getting bananas into the public image, creating a demand for bananas in the U.S. Obviously, we know bananas don't really grow that much in the U.S. In June 1954, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency launched a coup d'etat named Operation PB Success. The CIA backed a small force that was led by Carlos Castillo Armas with a psychological warfare campaign to portray military defeat as a foregone conclusion. During the coup itself, Bernays was the primary supplier of information for the international news wires, Associated Press, United Press International, and the International News Service. So he played a major role in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Jacobo Árbenz, not even necessarily a socialist or a communist, a progressive liberal anti-imperialist who was initiating land reforms. And that's actually interesting, tying in with the anniversary of Che Guevara's birthday. Che Guevara was living in Guatemala at the time of the coup, and it was one of the events that helped to radicalize him toward communism. Is seeing this coup, and Edward Bernays, who we're talking about now, was the media mastermind behind this coup. And Bernays' books include Propaganda, Public Relations, The Engineering of Consent, Your Future in Public Relations, among others. And this is a really interesting quote. In 1928, in Propaganda, he argued that public relations is not a gimmick, but a necessity. And this is a direct quote from him. This gave me chills reading this quote. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires and control the public mind. That's Edward Bernays, the great uncle of Marc Randolph, who is the founder and first CEO of Netflix. So that's really, I found that so fascinating. But Caleb, your response, your thoughts to all of that on Bernays?
Well, this is the thing that is very unseen. And that whole thing about the invisible government. When we think of the intelligence apparatus, CIA, NSA, naval intelligence, military intelligence, we immediately think of like running around blowing things up. That's largely not what the intelligence apparatus does. A lot of what the intelligence apparatus does is very carefully manipulate the public narrative, very carefully nudge different proxy forces, people aligned with the United States around the world that have some level of autonomy, and nudge them to do what the United States wants, managing public opinion, manipulating people, enabling different forces to do different things, cultivating counter gangs and entities that can be useful to imperialism around the world. That's mainly what intelligence apparatuses do. And a lot of it is not very exciting. And I would assume that nowadays, a lot of it is done behind a computer screen. Very little of it even involves human contact, right? And they just, but that's largely what the intelligence agencies do. And we know about Project Mockingbird, which was revealed during the 1960s and 70s. A lot has been revealed by Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and such, and that framing public opinion. Yes, those are the people that ultimately have the power. Look, public opinion equals power, and manipulating public opinion and getting people to go along with what the powers that be would want is one of the main ways that you hold power and maintain the illusion of democracy, right? And there's a whole history of Noam Chomsky's very good documentary, Manufacturing Consent, and all of that. I mean, this is something all of us realize. But Edward Bernays is very much the father of that kind of thing. I mean, and there's a long history of them selling wars with propaganda. We remember, they talk about how they took photographs of prisoners from Rikers Island and said that they were people in Cuba that were being mistreated. And, and I believe it was William Randolph first said, I'll provide the photographs, you provide the war. And there's a long history of this kind of thing. And that's Edward Bernays' particular, that was his bread and butter. What's interesting, though, is that especially post-World War II, when television came into being, what Edward Bernays would never have dreamed of, I mean, this stuff just really got big. In particular, there's something called the Tavistock Institute. I believe it's, the Tavistock Institute for Social Research, or the Tavistock Institute for Human Psychology, or something like that. It's in Britain. And that was very much, during World War II, it was the Psychological Operations Research Unit of British intelligence. And after World War II, it primarily became contracted by private companies, the Rockefeller Foundations and the Rockefeller think tanks, television companies, music and record producers and all of that just paid lots of money to this institute in Britain to do psychological research. And it's funny because it's like when you bring up Tavistock, immediately people like roll their eyes. If you ever heard the phrase, people roll their eyes and say, "Oh boy!" But if you look at look, it's not a secret that the reason that Beatles music was so popular in the United States was because they had done huge amounts of research to find out what kind of music people would really like and what kind of music would hit people in a psychological way that they would get very excited about it. And when you look at those old clips, I don't know if you've ever seen those old clips of Beatlemania. When the Beatles would perform, and there's all these young girls going, ah, they look like they're losing their minds and they're sobbing and losing. It's insanity. It's mass insanity. You look at it, but it was engineered. All kinds of psychological research. Rock and roll music has been around forever, but the Tavistock Institute spent a lot of money and worked with record companies to, produce a type of rock music that was particularly potent and would hit people in a particular way. And what's particularly crazy is, the Beatles only had one tour of the United States. They toured the United States, they went to Ohio, they went to Tennessee, and the country went nuts. And the Ku Klux Klan took shots at them and protested their concerts, and there were bomb threats and shots fired at. And what was going on is a lot of these Southern preachers, these Pentecostal preachers who would do these kind of hypnotic prayer services and all of that, they were freaked out to see that there was a rock concert. If people went to a Beatles concert, it had roughly the same effect on people. Right. The same kind of hypnotic trance it would get the audience into, the same kind of emotional impact, except there was no religion associated with it. And so you had a mobilization by all these Southern pastors who were just fired up against the Beatles, and the Beatles, were in so much danger they never toured again. So that this whole field of mass psychology and all of that is very, very interesting. And it's a big aspect of modern capitalism. I mean, social media, good night. Edward Bernays would never even dreamed of that.
Of course. And I want to play a clip for you, Caleb. This is just some background on Bernays. This is a animated book summary of his book, Propaganda. This is by Eudaimonia channel. I just want to play this and get your reaction to it.
Edward Bernays persuaded women to smoke. He convinced the public that bacon and eggs were the true all-American breakfast. He also facilitated the successful overthrow of a democratically elected Guatemalan president. How did one man achieve these remarkable accomplishments? The methods he used to achieve these astonishing events are explained in his book, Propaganda. What is propaganda? Propaganda nowadays is seen as a synonym for lies. It implies half-truths, selective history, bias, misleading information and other tricks. However, it can be used in a positive manner. For example, a campaign to improve public health through vaccination. When used in such a constructive way, it can be a progressive force. capable of improving and benefiting every life and every home. Specific propaganda should be seen as good or bad depending on the merit of the cause urged and the correctness of the information published. Modern propaganda is a consistent and continuing effort to create or shape events to influence public relations on an enterprise, idea or group. Edward Bernays worked for the Woodrow Wilson administration in the First World War, using a propaganda model promoting America's war efforts as bringing democracy to Europe. After swaying the public across the world with this slogan, he set to work on employing propaganda in peacetime. Due to negative implications surrounding the word propaganda because of its use by the Germans in the war, he promoted the term public relations. Public relations expert is concerned with bringing an idea to the awareness of the public using modern media communications and group formations of society. They act as an advisor to their clients. Edward Bernays had an impressive list of these clients, ranging from media companies such as Time Inc., CBS and NBC, through to individuals such as the President of the United States. He was not just a propagandist. He was concerned with courses of action, policies, systems and opinions, and the securing of public support for them. His responsibilities even included discovering new markets. The most famous new market Bernays was asked to uncover was that of women smoking cigarettes in the late 1920s. Up until then, women smoking in public was seen as a social taboo. Bernays set about removing this taboo to potentially double tobacco companies' possible clientele. First, he contacted a psychoanalyst to understand the societal perceptions that dissuaded women from smoking. He found that for feminists, cigarettes were like torches of freedom that symbolised their non-conformity and freedom from male oppression. He used this information to formulate a strategy and got a group of stylish women to march in an Easter Day parade. Prior to the parade, he had told the press that a group of women's rights marchers would light torches of freedom. On his cue, the women lit up their cigarettes in front of the eager photographers. The result was press coverage in several major newspapers including the New York Times, which helped to break the taboo against women smoking in public.
So I found that clip pretty interesting. I mean, just like how you were talking about creating a demand for something like a cigarette, which is literally a little piece of poison that is designed to kill us, but he was somehow able to market it. And what would you say are some modern day parallels? Because I know back then it was something like, for us now it seems kind of irrelevant, but what would you say are some modern day parallels with that propaganda?
Well, when it comes to Bernays, we're talking not so much about like incorrect facts, but more about associations, right? You're associating cigarettes with free women, with feminism, with sexuality, right? It's an association. Whereas a cigarette's a cigarette, right? Anyone can smoke a cigarette. Most conservative woman you ever met can smoke a cigarette, right? It's like there's nothing there, but you're making an association. Whenever you see any mention of North Korea on American television, immediately it's like a countdown. I start counting 1, 2, and immediately I see soldiers goose stepping. Right? You see the goose step, which is a march. It's a military marching style, but in the public mind, we associate that with Nazis. Right? So again, they're not saying anything. They could say Kim Jong-il, had a big parade today, and it's like North Korea. It's like countdown 1, 2, 3, and within 4 or 5 seconds, immediately you're going to see a bunch of guys goose stepping.
Right.
Tell us subconsciously that the North Koreans are Nazis. That's what they're saying. Another very common thing, and I love this because it hits home, particularly with you and I. This term tankies.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, basically, what this refers to is basically an American propaganda during the Cold War. Whenever the Soviet Union militarily intervened in a country, the footage that you saw on American television was these big, scary tanks rolling in, right? And in Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968, Afghanistan in 1979. big, scary rolling tanks. And then you have Tiananmen Square, the big, and people were trained to think of the Soviet Union and its allies not as being people, not as having real goals, but just being this scary, mechanical piece of machinery. And it worked very effectively. Look, in Afghanistan, there were many people who supported the Soviet Union and wanted the Soviet Union to protect them from the Taliban. In Czechoslovakia and in Hungary in 1956, there were many people who supported the Soviet Union, but those people never got a voice. The only thing on the Soviet Union side was this big, scary machinery thing, and that was very, very effective propaganda. You take that then to the Tiananmen Square events, right? That famous photograph that we've seen of the guy with the flag in front of the tank. Right. Well, you have to remember, first of all, that photograph was taken the day after the square had already been cleared. So it was the day afterwards, the square, there was a bunch of soldiers in the square. Somebody shows up in the square and like standing around in front of the tank. Right. And then they took the picture and it's like, oh, it's so beautiful. That wasn't even part of the protest. The protest was over at that point. That was just some guy who could have been anybody. We don't know who it was. And, it was just some guy was there with this thing. It had nothing to do with the protests that were happening. The protests were over at that point. The square had been cleared. It was done. But that photograph, it's like the scary, cold, mechanical machinery threatening the great individual who just wants his freedom. Not a crowd, mind you. Not a crowd. Just one individual. This is subtle propaganda. It's when you're not giving people incorrect facts. You're just with images, creating an association and implication that's very, very hard to debunk. And that's Edward Bernays, absolutely. It's what you say without words.
That's a great point. And actually, me and Comrade B-Level from Ewoks Unhinged, shout out to B-Level, we did a stream a few weeks back about the role of background music in propaganda as well, because that's another device that is used in film. Whenever they have interviews with people in the DPRK, it's always the scary horror music. It can never just be chill, cheerful music. And it's interesting to see that as well, because your body's conditioned to hear that and immediately feel anxiety and stress. And these are subtle cues designed to make you think a certain thing, make you feel a certain way about one thing or another. And it's just interesting to see how Bernays is one of the pioneers of that. There's another clip that I want to show you. He kind of goes into the psychology of propaganda, which I think is pretty interesting. So I want to get your thoughts on this one.
The study of mass psychology has brought to light the fact that a group can have certain mental characteristics distinct from that of an individual. Learning how the masses are influenced by various factors allows us to affect change in public opinion with a fair amount of accuracy. However, propaganda will never be an exact science, in the same way psychology or sociology isn't, because they deal with humans. If you can influence leaders, you automatically influence the groups they rule or have authority over. The group mind has impulses, emotions and habits, rather than thoughts as such. It makes up its mind by impulsively following the example of a trusted leader or authority figure. If this is not available, the herd thinks by cliches or images that stand for a group of experiences or ideas. An old propagandist would treat the human mind as an individual machine and rely on certain stimulus, often repeated, creating a habit. Similarly, they would reiterate an idea to create conviction with individuals. For example, to advertise bacon and eggs, adverts would contain phrases along the lines of "Eat more eggs," "Bacon is good for you," and "Bacon and eggs are cheap and healthy." A new propagandist such as Bernays, who understands group psychology, would first look at who influences eating habits. The answer is doctors and physicians. They would then suggest to these doctors and physicians to publicly state that eating bacon and eggs is good for you. The propagandist knows that a large number of people will follow the advice of their doctor due to the psychological relationship between a person and their doctor. A doctor signifies health, which in turn signifies long life. Bernays used these exact methods of leader influence to convince the public that bacon and eggs were the true all-American breakfast. Bernays sold more bacon, not by telling Americans that bacon is tasty, but by asking doctors the question, is it more healthy to eat a hearty breakfast or a skimpy breakfast? His advertisements then said, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend a hearty breakfast like this one, with a photo of bacon and eggs. An old advertiser would try to persuade an individual to buy an item immediately. For example, buy this piano now. Using reiteration and emphasis directed upon the individual, the advertiser tries to break down sales resistance. A new advertiser would, instead of directly penetrating sales resistance, try to remove it by creating circumstances that will swing emotional currents that will build purchaser demand. For example, a new advertiser, when selling a piano, would try to develop acceptance of the idea of a music room in the house, perhaps by arranging an exhibition of music rooms by well-known designers, inviting key people of influence with regards to buying habits, i.e. famous musicians. The music room will be accepted, and people with a music room will naturally think of buying a piano, believing it comes as their own idea. Instead of saying to the purchaser, "Please buy a piano," they have caused the purchaser to say, "Please sell me a piano." All these methods and techniques were used for Bernays' most extreme propaganda campaign, the overthrow of the Guatemalan government. The government had introduced labour laws that allowed workers to strike if their demand for higher wages were not met. The United Fruit Company had been the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala for several years, and these laws would affect their profits. Edward Bernays was hired by the United Fruit Company to persuade Americans that the then Guatemalan President, Jacobo Árbenz, was a communist, when in reality he was a liberal capitalist. Bernays ran an intensive campaign of misinformation to portray the company as the victim of the government for several years, including taking American journalists to Guatemala and arranging for them to interview only those who opposed Árbenz. Bernays' involvement led to US President Eisenhower to intervene, and ultimately Árbenz was overthrown in a US-sponsored coup designed to make the world safe for large US corporations.
So another interesting clip again from this interesting animated video of Bernays' book Propaganda. I find it really fascinating that how he creates the conditions for wanting something, and I feel like I see that nowadays with the media war on China. I was having a conversation with Bay Area 415 about the narrative on the Uyghurs in China and how they're kind of building up this campaign where they want people to cheer on for war. I mean, I remember that with 9/11 as well. The media was propping up the weapons of mass destruction. We need to go in and save people and build freedom. They weren't saying, let's go to war, let's go to war, let's go to war. They were like, but the poor Afghanis, the poor Uyghurs, the poor, and that's how they use emotion to make you want to call for something. And I don't know, I just found it really fascinating. What do you think, Caleb?
Well, nobody ever likes to feel like they're being persuaded. If you meet a salesman who you can tell is really trying to sell you something, you're immediately put off. And I think that's what Edward Bernays is getting at, right? Is that if you sell a war by directly telling people we want a war, most people are going to be like, well, actually, I think war is a bad thing. I'm not going to listen to you. You have to do it in a way that people reach the conclusion on their own to some degree or other, right? That subtlety is important in propaganda. And that rather than directly telling people, what it is, you appeal to their biases, right? You appeal to pre-existing biases. In there, he talked about the appeal to authority with doctors and such. And when it comes to elected officials, I've often said that that what's far more important than the elected officials is the layer of people around them. Right, you know what I'm saying, and that's really, really, really important. Like with Obama, right? Obama said his biggest regret was going into Libya without a clear plan. But the Libyan intervention really was the result of work done by Ben Rhodes, by Samantha Power, by Anne-Marie Slaughter, and other people that were surrounding Obama that knew how to manipulate him and push his buttons, right? And that the advisors, who often don't get anywhere near as much attention, we rarely know who they are. It's generally the opposition that finds out who they are and publicizes it, because the candidates don't want you to know who their advisors are. Those people often, politicians have a very carefully written out life story that's made for TV and all of that. But the life story of the advisors and the people that are doing the advising and the manipulating, those people's life story is often very interesting, and you can learn a lot more. And those people are often a lot more less appealing if you look into them. And what's particularly interesting is that this is not a new development. In ancient Rome, almost every emperor had a soothsayer, they were called, right? And these soothsayers were considered to be very important. Probably one of the first bodies like the UN was the temple at Delphi, which was this temple on this island in the middle of the Mediterranean that all the ancient kings and empires would go to like get, mystical predictions about the future from, right? And that all the kings were going to the temple at Delphi, this island in the middle of the Mediterranean they thought was the center of the world. It was the center of the known world at the time. But there was a temple that said, know thyself. They would all go there and they would do this really complicated, show, and then they would have this woman who they would give hallucinogenic drugs to, and she was supposed to be the oracle, right? And she would go little as she was on drugs, and then the priests would say, oh, what she's saying is, and then tell the king what they wanted him to hear, right? And that the temple at Delphi, because all the ancient kings were going there, they were heavily influenced by it. In particular, if you read the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, you'll notice some of the most important figures are people that played this role. Daniel, who was thrown into the lion's den. That was a story I always heard about the Bible when I was a kid. Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Why is he thrown into the lion's den? Well, Daniel is interpreting the king's dreams. And he's doing a way better job of interpreting the king's dreams than all the other sorcerers and soothsayers are. And they're quite jealous of him. So they throw him in the lion's den. And Joseph, right? Joseph, he's the coat of many colors or whatever. And eventually, how does Joseph rise up in Egypt? Well, again, he's interpreting the king's dreams. He's like the king's soothsayer, or maybe he's the king's therapist, I guess, right? He sits on the couch with the king, and the king says the dream he had, and they delve into the king's personality. And again, it's the same role that Ben Rhodes played with Obama, the same role that Samantha Power played. They learn to know the leader, learn how to push the leader's buttons, and learn to subtly push their own agenda. That's very important, right? And that, again, if Ben Rhodes had just walked in and said, you know what, Obama, I want you to overthrow Gaddafi, Obama probably would have said, well, I don't want to be remembered as a war president. That's not, I wouldn't, but again, it's like learning people, and it's the power behind the throne that often has the power. And I think that gets overlooked in history and in politics. If you want to know what a politician's going to do, look at who's around them and who knows them and who has worked on them. And then you'll find out what they're likely to do. And that's a big point in my book on Kamala Harris. I talk about who Kamala Harris rides with, who she surrounds herself with. And it's the Hillary Clinton State Department, largely. And that's why I find Kamala Harris to be quite disturbing. Biden is a little bit safer than Kamala Harris. I think that if Kamala Harris were to enter the presidency, which is very likely, things would escalate internationally very, very quickly.
Most definitely, especially with a lot of the narratives about inclusion and diversity, and they're creating this narrative where they can have somebody like Kamala Harris step up and become the new intersectional woke face of U.S. imperialism. And they've created this campaign in the media superstructure to facilitate that process. Something comes to mind that's really interesting. One of my friends, he used to work at a bar, and there's a lot of psychology that goes into running a bar that I find really fascinating. And one of the things he told me was that a lot of bars that you go to, if you look at the menu, it's usually really salty foods that are very high in sodium. Sliders, burgers, right? Sliders that have a lot of salt, deep fried French fries or onion rings, deep fried zucchini, a lot of deep fried foods, a lot of burgers, a lot of things that have a high sodium salt content. Because then what happens when you do that, you get very thirsty. And lo and behold, you're at a bar, let's get a beer, then it becomes 2 beers, and it becomes 3 beers. And those two kind of feed into each other, because the more you drink as well, the hungrier you get. And so it becomes this cyclical process where they're both feeding on each other. And before you know it, you spend $200, you're probably gained like 10 pounds just from that one sitting, you're drunk. And they've created a situation where they're not going into your face to say, buy this drink, buy this drink, buy this drink, but they create the conditions under which you want to do that. And I feel the same way about regime change efforts as well. I think that I'm very concerned, especially after this G7 summit, the ramping up of war against China. It seems like right now the empire, the hives of Iran is kind of moving its attention away from Russia, although the war's still going on against Russia. But it seems like China is really the enemy number one right now for the U.S. And my fear is that they're going to hijack the Palestinian solidarity movement, or the movement in solidarity with Muslims being under attack by Israel, for China, and that they're going to say, we have to go in and defend Xinjiang, we have to defend the Uyghurs. Do you see something similar happening as well with manufacturing this war?
Absolutely. I feel like, there's an anti-China narrative, and again, they're trying to create a situation where, the claims of Adrian Zenz and other faulty allegations are being treated as undisputed fact. And that's certainly disturbing. One particular thing, when you were talking about the bars and all of that, it really gets down to, no one ever wants to feel like they've been convinced of anything. But they want to, the idea is to lead people to think they're making their own choices when they're not. The most famous example is, I recall being a college student, and I would get people who I would try to get to read communist material, and you read the Workers' World or the Revolutionary Worker or whatever. And they'd say, no, I can't read that. That's propaganda. And I'd say, well, what about BBC? What about, oh, well, that's just, I read that, but I decide for myself, right? And it's like, right. And it's like, well, if you're reading a left-wing publication, well, that's pushing an agenda on you. But the mainstream media, they're just, they just, they just tell it how it is. And I've noticed that it's a really consistent thing, is all the people who have very mainstream views in the United States all have this illusion that they think for themselves. Right? Yep. It doesn't occur to them that everyone else thinks exactly the same thing that they think, right? And then on top of that, right, this whole thing about brainwashing. So if you think the opposite of what mainstream media thinks, they say, oh, you must have just been brainwashed. Well, brainwashing is about conformity, right? Brainwashing is about groupthink, right? So if you were brainwashed, you would think what everyone else is thinking, right? But if you think for yourself, right, you might come to another conclusion. So it's very weird how this works. But yeah, in the United States, everyone thinks for themselves. That's why they can't investigate independent views and all come to the same conclusions. Everyone is free to think. But the scariest thing that I've noticed is that that part of the way, probably the most effective way that the propaganda is carried out in the United States, is just discouraging people, right? Making people feel like it's just too complicated. And that's something mainstream media does a lot, right? You have like your hard neocon right-wing American that's pushing an agenda. Iran is aggressive, Cuba, but for most of the public, the more liberal thing is, it's just so complicated. And they work really hard to make it sound boring, make it sound uninteresting. And the New York Times, I hate the New York Times with passion. Every time I buy the New York Times, it's a waste of money, because the articles are all written in this way to be like, it'll be like, whatever the big issue is, oh, okay, there's this, and then there's that, and it's actually way more complicated than you think, so just don't worry about it. That's basically the tone of every article in the New York Times is, it's designed to make you gradually turn your brain off. If you, the Wall Street Journal and the neocon press, they give you the straight dope. This is what the empire wants you to believe. I love reading that, because then I get I don't agree with it, obviously, but I know what they want me to believe. New York Times, on the other hand, is running interference, and it's trying to get you to think, okay, and pretty soon you're tired and you're asleep and whatever. And the person who wrote it feels like they're really intelligent and smart. And NPR can be like that too. NPR is very good at that, where it's like, it's like they present an issue, they bring up some of the points that might be critical and some of the other points, and pretty soon everything's lost and everyone's fallen asleep and they've moved on. And that's kind of how the liberals handle things, which is different than how the hard right and the neocons handle things.
That's a great way of breaking it down. The New York Times is kind of just creating a lot of noise, distractions, smoke screens to distract people, bore the crap out of people, and make it seem like it's so complicated. And I hear that a lot from those types on YouTube, bread tubers like Vosh and others, who are like, look, it's complicated, it's complex, there's a lot of bad guys in the situation, and it just serves as a way to overstimulate you to a point where you no longer want to engage with it. And I found this other interesting clip this last clip that I found about Edward Bernays and his role again in the 1954 coup against Árbenz in Guatemala. And we see so much of the same tactics in the media used today. So I just want to play a little bit of that to get your response.
One of Bernays' main clients was the giant United Fruit Company. They own vast banana plantations in Guatemala in Central America. For decades, United Fruit had controlled the country through pliable dictators. It was known as a banana republic. But in 1950, a young officer, Colonel Árbenz, was elected president. He promised to remove United Fruit's control over the country. And in 1953, he announced the government would take over much of their land. It was a massively popular move, but a disaster for United Fruit, and they turned to Bernays to help get rid of Árbenz.
United Fruit brings in Bernays, and he basically understood that what United Fruit Company had to do was change this from being a popularly elected government that was doing some things that were good for the people there into this being very close to the American shore, a threat to American democracy, that it being at a time in the Cold War when Americans responded to issues of the Red Scare and what communism might do. He was trying to transform this, and brilliantly did transform it into an issue of a communist threat very close to our shores, taking United Fruit again as a commercial client out of the picture and making it look like a question of American democracy, American values being threatened.
In reality, Árbenz was a democratic socialist with no links to Moscow. But Bernays set out to turn him into a communist threat to America. He organized a trip to Guatemala for influential American journalists. Few of them knew anything about the country or its politics. Bernays arranged for them to be entertained and to meet selected Guatemalan politicians who told them that Árbenz was a communist controlled by Moscow. During the trip, there was also a violent anti-American demonstration in the capital. Many of those who worked for United Fruit were convinced it had been organized by Bernays himself. He also created a fake independent news agency in America called the Middle American Information Bureau. It bombarded the American media with press releases saying that Moscow was planning to use Guatemala as a beachhead to attack America. All of this had the desired effect.
In Guatemala, the Jacobo Árbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
What was profoundly new in terms of what Bernays did is he took this menace to our backyard in Guatemala. For the first time, we saw Reds a couple hundred miles from New Orleans who Eddie Bernays had us believing were a true threat to us, that it was going to be a Soviet outpost in our backyard.
But what Bernays was doing was not just trying to blacken the Árbenz regime. He was part of a secret plot. President Eisenhower had agreed that America should topple the Árbenz government, but secretly. The CIA were instructed to organize a coup. Working with the United Fruit Company, the CIA trained and armed a rebel army and found a new leader for the country called Colonel Árbenz. The CIA agent in charge was Howard Hunt, later one of the Watergate burglars.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Árbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
As planes flown by CIA pilots dropped bombs on Guatemala City, Edward Bernays carried on his propaganda campaign in the American press. He was preparing the American population to see this as the liberation of Guatemala by freedom fighters for democracy.
He totally understood that the coup would happen when the public and the press, when conditions in the public and the press allowed for a coup to happen, and he created those conditions. He was totally savvy in terms of just what he was helping create there in terms of this overthrow. But ultimately he was reshaping reality, reshaping public opinion in a way that's undemocratic and manipulative.
On June the 27th, 1954, Colonel Árbenz fled the country, and Árbenz arrived as the new leader. Within months, Vice President Nixon visited Guatemala. In an event staged by United Fruit's PR department, he was shown piles of Marxist literature that had been found, it was said, in the presidential palace.
this is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that, we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given. And we are sure that under your leadership, supported by the people whom I have met by the hundreds on my visit to Guatemala, that Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people. Thank you very much for allowing us to see this exhibit of communism in Guatemala.
Very crazy stuff. The same could be applied to modern day 2021. Nixon kind of sounds like Samantha Power a little bit in that clip, just in terms of talking about spreading democracy and all of this. Caleb, your reaction to this clip? By the way, that's a clip from The Century of the Self, a documentary by Adam Curtis. And I just found it fascinating. I mean, we can literally copy and paste that same language and template into the 21st century, but your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it shows pretty well how they were able to frame the elected government of Guatemala as a brutal communist dictatorship and set the stage for a U.S. imperialist intervention. And they do this with country after country after country. No matter how much the public votes for Hugo Chavez or Maduro or Evo Morales or the Sandinistas, they're still dictators. Why? Because they are, right? And, now they've got this whole formulation, which I find kind of fascinating, that the kind of academic voices of imperialism are pushing. This concept of democratic regression, what they call it, right? That democracy is being eroded around the world. What that means is the population elects leaders, and these leaders are democratically elected, but once they get in office, they change society. And if you change society, it's not democracy anymore. What does that mean? It's like, generally that's why people elect leaders, is they want them to make change that will improve society. But according to so many of these articles I've read from the Council on Foreign Relations and all these places, the fact that, people in Russia voted for Putin, but then Putin got into office and changed society means it's no longer a democracy, even though the Russian public overwhelmingly agrees with those changes, right? In Venezuela, they voted for Hugo Chavez. Chavez proceeded to change Venezuelan society. But even though the people wanted those changes, it's not democracy. If your government actually does stuff, it's not democratic. But of course, what is the changing? The changing is tampering with the independent institutions. And what are these independent institutions? The military, the private sector, the intelligence agencies. And they were independent, before these, undemocratic leaders got elected, right? In the 90s, when, the private sector in Russia was under the control of Western corporations, it was independent. Well, not exactly independent, under the control of the West, but when the West controls it, it's independent, right? When the Venezuelan military was working with the American military, it was independent, right? When the Venezuelan intelligence services were working with American intelligence, they were independent, right? You're independent if you work with the West, because the West ruling and Western domination is just the natural, that's just the way things are. When you start tampering with it, all of a sudden you're tampering with independent institutions. And it shows how, again, if they rule, it's just de facto. Right? The rule of Western corporations, the dominance of Western ideology. This isn't propaganda. This isn't imperialism. This is just the way the world naturally works. U.S. imperialism dominates the world. Our ideology, our views dominate the world. Our military, our intelligence agencies always have the upper hand. That's just normal. That's just, it's just like the sky being blue or whatever. But if other people do something, then there's something authoritarian and brutal going on, even if there's a popular mandate. And this is if you read the Foreign Affairs publication, if you listen to Biden's speeches about democracy being under attack around the world, this is what they're basically saying, is that whether it's the new right in Europe, which is definitely problematic and not socialist or not really anti-imperialist, but it's asserting a new level of independence in Europe, and or it's anti-imperialists in the developing world. They're all considered to be democratic regression, whereas if the world were just the way the United States would like it to be, then that's just democracy taking its course. And this is the new framing of arguments, and it's kind of a desperate scramble on the part of the imperialists, because it's during the neocon years they had their spreading democracy and all, and this is kind of a desperate scramble, because it shows they're losing ground very quickly. They're losing ground very, very, very quickly. One thing I will say, though, I will add, is that academia, during the Cold War in the 70s and 80s, post 1968, right? 70s and 80s, even up into the 90s. There was an understanding that academia's job was to kind of be critical of U.S. foreign policy. You had Noam Chomsky, you had voices in academia who would say, well, the USA backs dictators and all of that. Academia has really changed. Now that there's this feeling that every child in the United States should go to college, which that was not the feeling in the 80s and 70s, right? But now that every child should go to college, and there's this feeling every single child should go to college, everyone needs to go to college, suddenly in academia, in fields like political science and international studies and all that, you don't hear dissident views, right? When it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Syria, look, I worked at the UN. I worked in the UN press corps. And, I'm there, I'm working with, anti-imperialist news agencies. But I sat in the same booths with people who worked at ABC and NBC and Fox and BBC and all these networks. And I would sit there, and these people have gone to Harvard, and they've gone to Yale, and they've gone to the elite schools. They have like the best education, and those jobs to get on mainstream outlets and report from the UN is very competitive. There's like hundreds and thousands of people who want those jobs. I talk to these people that are like the most well-educated, high-achieving people who went to the best schools, and like it's never occurred to them that there might be another side to the Syrian war. And I say, well, there's some Syrians that think that Assad is better and they sit there and they've never heard this before. And they're fascinated by it because they've never heard this perspective before. You talk about Ukraine and you say, well, in Ukraine, again, Euromaidan, and you start telling them this and they just look at you like, what? I've never heard this, right? That's not how it was during the late Cold War. In the 70s and 80s, that wouldn't have been the case. If you talked about Nicaragua, somebody who went to Harvard or Yale would know both sides of the narrative. They would probably have the U.S. side, but they would at least know some of the other sides. It's not like that now. Now, academia has been just completely lined up behind U.S. foreign policy. And so that's creating this weird new dynamic. And oddly, I don't know if you noticed this, but Saturday Night Live, when they were doing a sketch a couple of years ago where they were making fun of a Trump rally, and if you looked at it, the way they were portraying Trump supporters was almost the way Venezuelan media, right-wing media in Venezuela, I should say, portrays Maduro supporters. They're ignorant hillbillies, poor people who don't understand the world and don't understand. It was the same kind of thing, and that politics in the United States is evolving in this weird way where we're very much starting to get this educated elites who know better versus the broad ignorant masses. It's weird because the broad ignorant masses are being portrayed as right-wing, and this elite that wants to spread human rights and free markets around the world is being portrayed as left-wing and woke. So it's getting very, very weird. But ultimately, the ultimate conclusion of this, right, which again, I'm probably a decade ahead of myself, the ultimate conclusion of this is the revival of working class populism, right? Yeah. And it's going to be a long, painful process. But the ultimate conclusion of this is the working class becoming the populists and anti-imperialists, and the so-called woke left becoming the defenders of the status quo. But this is a long, complex process, and it's playing out as the propaganda shifts. In the United States. The Cold War, the late Cold War normal of the 70s and 80s was that liberals, critics of U.S. foreign policy, were a bunch of hippy-dippy college professors drinking their lattes, but average Americans were neocons who loved the military and were evangelicals and all of that. And the 2008 financial crisis threw that for a loop. And then Trump came along, and things are getting all muddled up. And the political landscape is really shifting very, very quickly. You'll notice, like, the New Atheists, when they came out, were considered to be a left-wing group, right? Largely. That was, a response to the religious right in Bush. Now the New Atheists are largely considered to be part of the right wing. If you listen to, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, people like that, they're putting out very racist ideas. They're putting out, very, very pro-Israel, anti-Islamic ideas, and they're considered to be on the right, even though they were key. You couldn't have really had Obama and the rise of Obama without the New Atheists, without that kind of pushback against the religious right. So, it shows how these demographics are flipping and switching very rapidly. There's a couple other things that struck me about the clip. Well, why don't you respond then?
And I think that's such a great point about the liberal, snobby academics and journalists who sort of occupy what they believe is this middle position of invisibility. It seems like they tend to think they have an invisibility cloak where they occupy no political bias within the spectrum. They see themselves as neither being too left or too right. they're neutral, they're objective. And it's a very metaphysical way of understanding reality, where even though they work for the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC, companies that are actively invested in war in the Middle East and Latin America, that are financed and bankrolled by oil companies, by banking institutions, by the weapons industrial complex, by the prison industrial complex, they don't really register in their minds that in itself, even before they walk into the newsroom, that creates a bias, that frames the discussion in a certain way and frames the narrative. But they don't seem to believe that. And I'm sure you do, working in journalism, you have seen liberal journalists with that attitude, like, I don't have a political bias, I'm neutral, I'm objective, I don't have the space. But in reality, they do, solely because of the institutions they work for. And I saw that a lot as a student of journalism in New York as well, seeing a lot of liberals who believed that they were just sort of detached from reality, that they occupied no space in media. But luckily, I think the media landscape is changing in a way that people want authenticity. People want to know straight up where the person is coming from. And I think that's the direction it's moving toward. And I think, like you said, it represents the fear that a lot of these liberal journalists, warmongers have, that their invisibility cloak is being removed. People are seeing them for what they are from both the left and the right. And they rather hear from people like us who tell them straight up, like, look, I'm coming at this as a socialist, as an anti-imperialist. Here's what I believe, take it or leave it. And people want that. I think we're in the age of authenticity, where you can't go around saying you're neutral and objective because nobody believes it. Everyone thinks it's bullshit. But just kind of wrapping up here, Caleb, thanks again for joining us. It's been really a pleasure talking to you. Just this last question that I wanted to ask you is, what lessons can we as revolutionary journalists and content creators take from Bernays, even though obviously this is a guy who's done a lot of bad stuff, evil stuff, using propaganda in a negative way? What are some lessons that we can take from what he's done and apply them for the good for working class people?
Sure. Well, as far as lessons that we can take from him is know your audience, know their motivations, and keep context in mind, right? And keep the implications of words. You know, when I'm arguing with people, for example, about the situation, you know, in China, I'm very careful the words I use, right? Because again, the public, you know, Holocaust deniers are some of the worst people in the world, okay? I mean, the Holocaust is one of the most well-documented events in world history. There's no question that millions and millions of Jewish people and millions of others were killed, murdered in gas chambers, right? But Holocaust deniers, right, and the people who deny it because they're anti-Semites, you know, they're kind of trotted out as an example of anyone who would question anything, any allegation, right? So I'm always very careful what words I use when I'm talking about the history of socialist countries, when I'm arguing against allegations in the mainstream press, because I know that the desire is to frame me as if I'm the same as these anti-Semitic lunatics who claim that one of the most well-documented events in history didn't happen, right? And you have to remember that you cannot say, you know, the words you use, not just what you say, but how you say it can be very, very important. One other thing that struck me is in that clip you showed, they talked about how Edward Bernays created a news agency that would ideas. Many examples of this. The most blatant example in our time is Epoch Times, right? Epoch Times is well known to be the propaganda arm of the Falun Gong cult, which is a crazy, fanatical religious cult of people that want to overthrow the Chinese government. It's a religious cult. I mean, their position on all kinds of issues like homosexuality and women voting and interracial marriage, and they're not exactly the most down to earth rational folks, right? But they have this newspaper called the Epoch Times. Now, you know, you can get the Epoch Times; it has their perspective. But what I've also seen is that mainstream news outlets will take quotes from the Epoch Times, right? And the Epoch Times will float an idea. They're not credible. But then other agencies can take the Epoch Times story and it creates it's a way to push an agenda without revealing that. Every time I hear Epoch Times, I immediately think crazy Falun Gong cult, right? But most people don't. Most people think, okay, the New York Times has this news story and they're just quoting this other source that's, the Epoch Times. And a lot of times, Epoch Times, what does that mean? That's a very, it's a normal sounding name. Another great example is United Press International, UPI. Right, that just sounds like the most noble name. United Press International. That's a a news agency created by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church, which is very much tied to the Republican Party, right? But often you will see rumors or claims about Latin America that United Press International says that unnamed sources told them that. That's straight from the CIA, right? That's basically the CIA called up, the UPI and the Moonies and said, this is what we're going with. I noticed after the attempted drone assassination of Maduro, a number of news outlets said, oh, it was a gas explosion. It wasn't a gas explosion, right? But unnamed sources claimed it was a gas explosion. Yeah, that was completely ridiculous because there were all kinds of witnesses who saw that drone and it was not a gas explosion. Right. But the fact that was all over means that somebody planted that really quickly. There was some kind of effort to do that. In United Press International, the Washington Times, again, it just sounds like a newspaper in Washington, D.C., the Washington Times. Well, that's also an outlet run by the Unification Church, which is tied to the Contras of Nicaragua, one of the main anti-communist, activist, religious, fanatical groups. And this is something that they do also, is they'll create an entity that seems like it might be credible, and then that entity is not really meant to influence public opinion, right? But it feeds information. It creates degrees of separation. The CIA calls up the Epoch Times. The Epoch Times publishes it. And then the New York Times quotes the Epoch Times, and everyone just thinks, okay, well, it might be true, right? And that's a game that is played also, where they create these layers, right? According to so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who it all just gets back to the CIA, but it looks like it's got some credibility to it.
Such a great example. It also reminds me of this, I think it's called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights or something like that. It's just some one random dude in London who is just publishing out information. And even during the coup in Bolivia in 2019, all these random fake news agencies have started popping up, and people really forget how easy it is. I can go on WordPress right now and buy a domain for $20 in 20 minutes and have a fake news site up and running. And so that's something that is really important to keep in mind. But Caleb, it's really been a pleasure speaking to you. Always a pleasure talking to you about this sort of stuff. I mean, I think it's something that we're constantly bombarded on the day-to-day with all these new propaganda stories, and it's good to kind of just take a moment and step back and look at the theoretical foundations of the war machine and propaganda. So for those who are watching and listening, please subscribe to Caleb's channel. He's a journalist and political analyst based in New York. Thanks again, Caleb, so much. Hopefully you could come and visit me sometime in California again, and I hope all is well. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Yep.